Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We are a repository of stories, a quiet space where we examine the shadows that follow human nature and the echoes they leave behind. Fiction, for many, is an escape, a carefully constructed world with its own rules, heroes, and villains. But what happens when the line between the screen and the street dissolves? When the fantasy we consume begins to dictate the reality we inhabit? This is the unsettling world of copycat crimes, where fiction provides the script and real life becomes the unwilling stage for its most terrifying scenes. Tonight, we explore the cases where reality tragically and violently imitated art. Case 1. The Natural-Born Killers Inspired Crimes. In 1994, Oliver Stone's film Natural-Born Killers exploded onto the cultural landscape. It was not a quiet arrival. The film, a dizzying, hyper-stylized satire, chronicled the murderous road trip of Mickey and Mallory Knox. Portrayed by Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis, the pair were charismatic, deeply in love, and pathologically violent. They killed dozens with a casual, almost gleeful abandon, all while being relentlessly pursued and simultaneously glorified by a ravenous media. Stone's intention was a scathing critique of how modern media sensationalizes violence, transforming killers into celebrities. The film was a visual assault, a frantic collage of different film stocks, animation, and surreal imagery, designed to mimic the chaotic information overload of television culture. However, a message, no matter how clear the creator's intent, is ultimately subject to the interpretation of its audience. And for some, the satire was lost. The critique was invisible. What they saw was not a warning, but a blueprint. They didn't see the horror. They saw the romance, the freedom, the anti-establishment rebellion of Mickey and Mallory. They saw a fantasy worth living. This brings us to March of 1995 in Oklahoma. Here, we meet two young people poised on the precipice of adulthood. Their lives a tangle of teenage angst, perceived injustice, and a yearning for something more, something different. Sarah Edmondson, 18, and her boyfriend, Benjamin James Darris, also 18. To an outsider, they might have seemed like any other young couple navigating the complexities of their world. But beneath the surface, a deep dissatisfaction simmered. They felt alienated, misunderstood by their families, and constrained by the quiet life of their small town. They were looking for an escape, a narrative to step into. On the night of March 5, 1995, they found one. They settled in to watch Natural-Born Killers, allegedly while under the influence of LSD. The film's hallucinatory style, combined with the psychedelic drug, did not just entertain them, it consumed them. In the chaotic, violent, and strangely romantic odyssey of Mickey and Mallory Knox, Sarah and Ben saw a reflection of their own desires. The film wasn't a movie anymore. It was a revelation. It was a permission slip. According to later confessions, a decision was made. They would leave their old lives behind. They would go on a road trip. They would become Mickey and Mallory. Ben shaved his head, just like Mickey Knox. Sarah kept her long, dark hair, an echo of Mallory. They packed a car and drove away from Oklahoma, heading east with no real destination, only a shared, deadly fantasy. For 2 days, their journey was uneventful. They were simply two teenagers on the road, living out a cinematic dream. But a fantasy built on violence requires a victim to make it real. The first intersection of their script with the real world occurred in Hernando, Mississippi. William Savage was a mill manager, a respected man in his community. He was a friend of Ben Darris's father. On March 7th, the pair arrived at the Cotton Gin where he worked. The exact motive for targeting him remains somewhat muddled, perhaps a pre-existing resentment, perhaps simply an opportunity. They confronted him. The details of what happened inside the gin are grim. Ben Darris, channeling the cold brutality of Mickey Knox, shot William Savage twice, killing him. The first act of their real-life movie was complete. There was no media frenzy, no stylized camera work. There was only the stark, silent finality of a life extinguished. With their fantasy now christened in blood, they continued their journey. The thrill, the sense of power was now palpable. They were no longer just playing a role. They were Mickey and Mallory. They drove from Mississippi into Louisiana, their path mirroring the chaotic, aimless violence of their idols. Their next stop would irrevocably alter another life and become the centerpiece of the legal firestorm that followed. Patsy Byers was working her shift as a cashier at a convenience store in Ponchatoula, Louisiana. She was a mother, a wife, a woman simply doing her job on an otherwise ordinary day. She had no idea that she was about to be cast as a supporting character in Sarah and Ben's horrific production. They entered the store, their intentions hidden behind a veneer of normalcy. They robbed the store, but the crime did not end there. In the film, Mickey and Mallory often left one person alive to tell the story, to spread their legend. In a chilling echo of this, Ben Darris forced Patsy Byers to her knees and shot her. But Patsy Byers did not die. The bullet tore through her neck, severing her spinal cord. She was left for dead, but she survived. She would, however, be quadriplegic for the rest of her life, confined to a wheelchair, unable to speak without the aid of a machine. She was the witness left behind, not to spread a myth, but to bear the devastating, lifelong testimony of their cruelty. The crime spree of Sarah Edmondson and Ben Darris was not long-lived. Their fantasy was potent, but their execution was clumsy. Unlike their cinematic counterparts who evaded capture for weeks, their run from the law was brief. A few days after the shooting of Patsy Byers, they were apprehended. The reality of their situation came crashing down. The glamour was gone, replaced by the cold, sterile environment of an interrogation room. It was during their confessions that the link to natural-born killers became explicit and undeniable. Both Sarah and Ben told investigators that the film was their direct inspiration. They spoke of watching it repeatedly, of wanting to emulate the characters. Ben Darris reportedly told a friend, "It's a good movie. It's about a guy and a girl who go on a killing spree. They're gods." For them, the film's satirical layer was not just lost. It was inverted. The critique of media glorification had become a source of personal glorification. They believed they were achieving a form of dark stardom. The legal proceedings were swift. Ben Darris, the triggerman, pleaded guilty to the murder of William Savage and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Sarah Edmondson, for her role in the crimes, received a sentence of 30 years. The criminal case was closed, but the story was far from over. Patsy Byers, from her wheelchair, decided to fight back. Her battle would not be against the two teenagers who had destroyed her life, but against the creators of the world they sought to inhabit. In a landmark lawsuit, Patsy Byers, represented by attorney and novelist John Grisham, sued Oliver Stone and Warner Brothers Studios. The lawsuit did not claim the film was obscene. Instead, it made a novel and explosive argument. It alleged that the film was a defective product and that the filmmakers were negligent because they knew, or should have known, that the film's content was so powerful and persuasive that it would incite susceptible viewers to commit acts of violence. The case, Byers versus Time Warner, ignited a fierce national debate about art, responsibility, and the First Amendment. The defense argued that holding filmmakers liable for the criminal actions of individuals who misinterpret their work would create a chilling effect on all forms of creative expression. Where would the line be drawn? Could the creator of Macbeth be sued for a politically motivated murder? Could a rapper be sued if a listener committed a crime mentioned in a song? They argued that the film was protected speech, and that the responsibility for the crimes lay solely with Edmondson and Darris. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that Natural-Born Killers was a special case. They contended that the film was not just violent, but that it actively glorified and romanticized the act of killing to a degree that was socially irresponsible. They presented evidence from criminologists and psychologists who testified about the potential effects of such media on impressionable minds, especially those with pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities. The legal battle raged for years, moving through the court system. It raised a question that society still grapples with: what is the duty of a creator? Is it simply to express their vision, or do they bear some responsibility for the foreseeable consequences of that expression? Ultimately, the courts sided with the filmmakers. The Louisiana Court of Appeal dismissed the lawsuit in 2001, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, effectively ending the legal challenge. The ruling affirmed the broad protections of the First Amendment, establishing that a work of art could not be held legally responsible for inspiring a crime. But the legal conclusion did little to resolve the moral and ethical questions. For Patsy Byers, who passed away in 1997 due to complications from her injuries, before the case was concluded, justice remained elusive. Her life and the life of William Savage were not plot points. They were real, tangible, and irrevocably lost or broken. The case of Sarah Edmondson and Ben Darris stands as one of the most direct and disturbing examples of life imitating art. It demonstrates a profound failure of interpretation, where a film intended as a warning was embraced as an instruction manual. The glossy, consequence-free violence of the screen proved to be a seductive lie. The reality was messy, brutal, and left a wake of unhealable trauma. It serves as a haunting reminder that while an artist creates a story, they have no control over the stories the audience tells themselves. For some, the characters on screen are not just characters. They are permissions. They are possibilities. And when those possibilities are embraced by those unmoored from empathy, the result is not a film, but a tragedy. The boundary between fiction and reality is more fragile than we care to admit, and sometimes the most horrific tales are not the ones we watch, but the ones we inspire. Case 2. The Scream Murders. If Natural-Born Killers was a chaotic art house critique, the next film to be woven into the fabric of true crime was its slick, commercially successful, and self-aware cousin. In 1996, director Wes Craven, a master of the horror genre, unleashed Scream upon an unsuspecting audience. The film was more than just a slasher. It was a phenomenon. It was smart, it was witty, and it was terrifyingly effective because it knew its audience loved horror movies as much as its creator did. The premise was simple yet revolutionary. A killer, hidden behind the now iconic Ghostface mask, a haunting, elongated visage inspired by Edvard Munch's painting The Scream, stalks a group of teenagers in the fictional town of Woodsboro. But this killer doesn't just hunt. He taunts. He calls his victims, his voice disguised by a digital modulator, and engages them in a deadly trivia game about horror films. The film's characters were acutely aware of the rules of the genre. They debated the cliches. Never say, "I'll be right back." Never have sex. Never drink or do drugs. They were living in a horror movie and they knew it. This meta-commentary was the film's genius. It created a shared experience with the audience, a knowing wink that said, "We're all in on the joke." The Ghostface persona itself was a terrifyingly blank canvas. Unlike Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, Ghostface wasn't a supernatural monster. It was a costume, a $5 mask, and a black robe. The killer could be anyone: a boyfriend, a best friend, a parent. The film's final twist revealed that the killer wasn't one person, but two: the main character's boyfriend and his best friend. Their motive? A twisted desire for fame and to create a real-life sequel to their favorite scary movies. Scream was a box office titan. It revived the slasher genre and spawned a legion of fans who delighted in its cleverness. But as with natural-born killers, a darker form of imitation began to stir in the film's wake. The very elements that made it so popular also made it dangerously easy to replicate. The mask was readily available. The voice changer was a simple gadget. The weapon, a buck 120 hunting knife, was easy to procure. And the script-haunting phone calls, preying on friends, was laid out for anyone who wished to follow it. The echoes began almost immediately. Law enforcement across the United States and Europe started reporting a rash of ghost-face crimes. Teenagers would don the mask to intimidate, rob, and terrorize. In many cases, these were cruel pranks or petty crimes. But in some, the imitation took a lethal turn. In January 1998, in Los Angeles, 37-year-old Gina Castillo was found stabbed to death in her home. The perpetrators were her own 16-year-old son, Mario Padilla, and his 14-year-old cousin, Samuel Ramirez. During their confession, they admitted to a chilling inspiration. They had become obsessed with Scream and its sequel, Scream 2. They purchased Ghostface costumes and voice changers. They planned the murder meticulously, intending to use the money they stole from Gina to fund a killing spree, buying more costumes and weapons to emulate the on-screen killers. The motive, as it was in the film, was a grotesque blend of greed and a desire for notoriety. A year later, in 1999, the pattern repeated itself in Harrogate, England. 14-year-old Daniel Gill and 15-year-old Robert Fuller, after watching Scream, lured their friend, 13-year-old Ashley Murray, to a secluded spot. Wearing ghost-face masks, they subjected him to a horrific attack, stabbing him 18 times in the head and neck. Miraculously, Ashley survived, but the psychological and physical scars would last a lifetime. When questioned, his attackers showed a disturbing lack of remorse, speaking of the film and how they had planned their own real-life horror scene. These cases were horrifying, but they were precursors to what is arguably the most infamous and meticulously documented Scream-inspired murder. This crime provides a terrifying window into the minds of two killers who didn't just imitate the movie. They tried to direct their own, with their friend cast in the role of the victim. This is the story of Cassie Jo Stoddart, Pocatello, Idaho, in the fall of 2006. It's a quiet city, nestled in the American West, a place where violent crime is an anomaly, something that happens elsewhere. Cassie Jo Stoddart was a bright and responsible 16-year-old. She was an excellent student at Pocatello High School, known for her artistic talent and her kind, gentle nature. She was trusted by her family, which is why on Friday, September 22, 2006, her aunt and uncle asked her to house sit for the weekend while they were out of town. The house was in a remote area, up a long, dark driveway, surrounded by trees. Perfect setting for a quiet weekend. Perfect setting also for a horror movie. Cassie invited her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, to come over and keep her company. Later that evening, another classmate, Brian Draper, called and asked if he could come over with his friend, Tori Adamczyk. Cassie, being friendly and welcoming, agreed. All four were 16 years old. They were classmates, part of the same social circle. On the surface, it was a normal teenage gathering. They watched a movie, Kill Bill Volume 2. They chatted. There was nothing to suggest the horrifying betrayal that was about to unfold. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were, to the outside world, unremarkable teenagers. Brian was known for his interest in filmmaking. He was often seen with a video camera, documenting his life and his friends. Tori was quieter, more introverted, but shared Brian's fascination with movies, particularly those of the horror genre. They were both fans of Scream, but their fandom was not passive. It was active, aspirational, and deeply malevolent. For weeks, they had been secretly planning to commit a murder. They wanted to know what it felt like. They wanted to become famous. They wanted to be the real-life versions of Billy and Stu, the killers from Scream. And they had chosen their victim, their friend, Cassie Jo Stoddard. Their entire visit that night was a reconnaissance mission. Around 10:30 p.m., Brian announced he was bored and wanted to go see a movie at the local theater. Tori agreed. They left the house, leaving Cassie and Matt alone. But they didn't go to the theater. Instead, they drove a short distance away, parked their car, and put on their costumes. Dark clothing, gloves, and pale, ghostly white masks. Not the iconic ghost face mask. Their masks were of a simpler, more generic horror variety, but the intent was the same. They crept back to the house, silently unlocked a basement door they had surreptitiously unlatched earlier, and slipped inside, descending into the darkness to wait. Upstairs, Cassie and Matt were oblivious. A short while later, the power in the house suddenly went out. The dogs began to bark frantically at the basement door. Matt and Cassie were unnerved. Matt would later recall a strange thudding sound from the basement, which they dismissed as a circuit breaker. Feeling uneasy, Matt called his mother and asked if he could stay the night, but she insisted he come home. She offered to let Cassie come stay at their house, but Cassie, ever responsible, insisted on staying to look after the pets and the home. It was a decision that sealed her fate. Matt left around 11:30 p.m., leaving Cassie all alone in the large, dark, isolated house. Downstairs, Brian and Tori waited. They had been the ones to cut the power, hoping to lure the couple down to the basement. When that failed, they waited for Matt to leave. Now, their victim was alone and vulnerable. They continued their attempts to frighten her, making loud noises, trying to draw her out. Cassie, terrified, locked the doors and huddled on the couch in the living room. The most chilling aspect of this case is that Brian and Tori documented their plans. On a series of videotapes, recorded before and after the murder, they laid bare their entire twisted fantasy. The tapes are a staggering document of adolescent narcissism and psychopathy. In the footage shot before the murder, the boys are giddy with excitement. They sit in a car, speaking to the camera as if they are directors of their own dark film. "We're going for our first kill," Brian Draper says, his voice brimming with a chilling, boyish enthusiasm. "I'm scared," Tori Adamczyk admits, but his fear is mingled with a palpable thrill. They discuss their influences. "We're inspired by the movie Scream," Draper states plainly. He smiles. "Hopefully this will go smoothly and we can get our victim." They talk about their chosen victim, Cassie Stoddard. They refer to her not with hatred, but with a terrifying detachment. She is not a person. She is a target, a prop in their production. "She's our friend," Adamczyk says. "But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices." They debate their alibi, their weapons, 2 daggers, and their plan. Their conversation is a grotesque imitation of the killers in Scream, analyzing their own future actions as if they were plot points in a script. Once Cassie was alone, their game began in earnest. They crept upstairs from the basement. They found her asleep on the couch. The attack was swift, brutal, and merciless. They stabbed her approximately 30 times. 12 of the wounds were potentially fatal. After the murder, they turned the camera on again. The giddy excitement was gone, replaced by a strange, agitated state. "We just killed Cassie," Draper says to the camera, his voice shaking, but not with remorse. "We've just left the house. This is not a fucking joke. I stabbed her in the throat," Adamczyk adds, "and I saw her lifeless body. It just went limp." They express a moment of panic about getting caught, but it's quickly subsumed by a sense of morbid accomplishment. They had done it. They had made their movie real. They had followed the script. The next day, Cassie's aunt and uncle returned home to a scene of unimaginable horror. The police were called, and an investigation began immediately. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, feigning ignorance and grief, were among the first to be questioned. They were Cassie's friends. They were there that night. Their alibi was that they had gone to the movie theater. But their story quickly unraveled. There was no evidence they had ever been to the theater. Surveillance footage and witness statements contradicted their claims. Under pressure, Brian Draper cracked. He led the police to a remote area in Black Rock Canyon, where they had buried the evidence. The masks, the clothing, the knives, and, most damningly, the videotape. When the investigators watched the tape, they were looking at a confession. It was a step-by-step guide to the murder, narrated by the killers themselves. Their inspiration, their motive, their actions all laid out for the camera. The trial was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. Both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were tried as adults. In their defense, their lawyers attempted to argue that they were immature teenagers caught up in a fantasy, unable to distinguish right from wrong. But the tapes told a different story. They showed planning, intent, and a chilling awareness of their actions. In April 2007, Brian Draper was found guilty of first-degree murder. A month later, Tori Adamczyk met the same fate. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The murder of Cassie Jo Stoddart is a profound tragedy that illustrates the darkest potential of copycat crime. For Draper and Adamczyk, Scream was not a cautionary tale about the dangers of blurring fiction and reality. It was the how-to guide. The film's self-awareness, its discussion of rules, and its anyone can be the killer ethos provided them with a framework for their own homicidal ambitions. The mask was not just a disguise. It was a tool of depersonalization, allowing them to see their friend not as a human being, but as a character to be eliminated. They sought the fame and notoriety of their fictional idols, Billy and Stu, and in their pursuit of that dark fantasy, they created a real-life horror story with no clever twists, no final girl escaping into the dawn, only the brutal and senseless end of a young life, and 2 others lost to a prison cell. All because they chose to believe that a scary movie was a script worth following. Case 3. The Dexter Killer, Mark Twitchell. The cases inspired by natural-born killers and Scream were largely products of youthful delusion, of impressionable minds twisting cinematic fantasy into a personal mandate for violence. They were chaotic, impulsive, and born of a desire to inhabit a pre-existing script. But as we move forward in time, we encounter a different, more chilling form of imitation, one that is not impulsive, but meticulously planned. Not a chaotic rampage, but a cold, calculated performance. This brings us to the world of a different kind of anti-hero, and a man who saw him not as a fictional character, but as a role model. In 2006, the television network Showtime introduced audiences to Dexter. The show was a critical and commercial success, presenting a protagonist unlike any other. Dexter Morgan, played by Michael C. Hall, was a blood spatter pattern analyst for the Miami Metro Police Department by day. By night, he was a serial killer. But Dexter operated under a strict, self-imposed moral framework he called the Code. Taught to him by his adoptive father, the Code dictated that he could only kill other murderers, those who had slipped through the cracks of the legal system. He was a monster who hunted monsters. The appeal of Dexter was complex. Viewers were drawn into his internal monologue, his struggle to feign human emotion, his dark passenger that craved violence. His meticulous process, the stalking of his prey, the preparation of his plastic-draped kill room, the dismemberment and disposal at sea was presented as a ritual, a science. He was a vigilante, a psychopath, and yet, in the twisted logic of the show, a force for a certain kind of justice. The show invited the audience to sympathize with a killer, to understand his compulsions. For one man in Edmonton, Canada, that invitation was taken as a call to action. Mark Twitchell was, on the surface, the picture of aspiring suburban normalcy. In 2008, at the age of 29, he was married with a young daughter, had a mortgage, and was trying to build a career as an independent filmmaker. He was charismatic and ambitious, constantly pitching projects and networking. But beneath this veneer of creativity and family life, a profound darkness was taking root, nurtured by failure and an all-consuming narcissism. His film projects had stalled, his ambitions outstripped his talent, and he craved a powerful, unforgettable story that would define him. He found his protagonist, his muse, in Dexter Morgan. Twitchell didn't just admire the show, he studied it. He created a secret Facebook account under Dexter Morgan's name, where he posted status updates echoing the character's thoughts and actions. He began to see his own life through a similar lens. He felt he possessed a dark passenger of his own. But unlike the fictional Dexter, Twitchell had no code. His targets would not be other killers. They would be innocent men, chosen at random, cast as victims in the real-life horror film he was preparing to direct. His first step was to build the set. In a quiet, residential neighborhood in South Edmonton, he rented the detached garage of a family home. The homeowners, who lived in the main house, assumed their new tenant would use it for storage or to work on a car. They had no idea that Twitchell was transforming it into a faithful recreation of Dexter's kill room. He lined the space meticulously with plastic sheeting the walls, the floor, everything. He set up a heavy steel table and acquired a set of restraints. He assembled his props: a stun baton, handcuffs, a hunting knife, and an array of cleaning supplies for the inevitable aftermath. This was not a hideout. It was a stage. With the set complete, he needed to cast his victim. He turned to the online dating website Plenty of Fish, a platform built on trust and the hope of connection. He crafted a female persona, Sheena, using photos of an attractive woman he found online. He wrote a convincing profile, presenting her as someone new to town, eager to meet people. He began to lure men into conversations, his ultimate goal being to entice them to his garage under the pretense of a date. On the evening of October 3, 2008, the first man took the bait. His name was Gillis Tatro. He had been exchanging messages with Sheena and agreed to meet her. The directions he was given were convoluted, leading him not to a house or a public place, but to the alley behind the rented garage. When he arrived, the garage door opened. The interior was dark. There was no sign of a woman. A voice told him to come inside. Tatro, confused but still hopeful, entered. The door slammed shut behind him. He was plunged into near-total darkness. Suddenly, a man wearing a hockey mask lunged at him, wielding a stun baton. The shock of the attack, the disorienting pain of the electrical current, sent Tatro to the floor. But he was a survivor. He fought back with a ferocity that Twitchell clearly did not anticipate. He grabbed for the mask, grappled with his attacker. In the struggle, he managed to get his hand on the man's gun, which he later realized was a plastic prop, and break free. He scrambled for the door, fumbled with the lock, and burst out into the alley, running for his life. Twitchell, his script ruined, chased after him but gave up. Tatro, terrified and bewildered, made it back to his car and escaped. In a decision that would haunt him, but one that is all too human, he did not go to the police. He was embarrassed. He felt foolish for having been duped by a fake online profile. He couldn't fully process what had happened. Was it a mugging? A bizarre prank? He tried to put the nightmarish encounter behind him, unaware that he was the sole survivor of a serial killer's dress rehearsal. For Mark Twitchell, the failure was infuriating. His plan, his perfect scene, had been foiled by an uncooperative actor. He analyzed what went wrong. The prop gun was unconvincing. His physical control was insufficient. He would not make the same mistakes again. He refined his script and went fishing for his next victim. A week later, he found him. Johnny Altinger, who went by John, was a 38-year-old computer technician. He was active, well-liked, and, like Gillis Tatro, looking for a connection online. He too began chatting with Sheena. He told his friends about his upcoming date, forwarding them the directions Sheena had sent him, the same directions that led to the garage. In an email to a friend, he wrote, "I've got a date tonight with a girl named Sheena. I'm supposed to meet her at her place if I don't come back. You'll know why." It was a joke, a throwaway line, but it would become a critical piece of evidence. On Friday, October 10th, 2008, John Altinger drove to the address and entered the garage. This time, there was no escape. Mark Twitchell was prepared. He overpowered Altinger, restrained him on the metal table, and began his performance. He revealed his true intentions, monologuing to his captive victim, explaining that he was a serial killer who intended to murder him. Altinger, according to Twitchell's own later accounts, tried to reason with him, to appeal to his humanity, but there was none to be found. Twitchell then murdered John Altinger, stabbing him with the hunting knife. The first act of his magnum opus was complete. Now came the second, the cleanup and the narrative control, just like Dexter. Over the next few days, Twitchell embarked on the gruesome task of dismembering Altinger's body on the table in the garage. He then attempted to burn the remains in a barrel, and when that failed, he dumped the pieces into a nearby storm sewer. His next step was to control the story of John Altinger's disappearance. He needed to become his victim. He accessed Altinger's email and Facebook accounts. He sent messages to Altinger's friends and his employer, claiming that he had met a wonderful woman named Jen and was spontaneously moving with her to Costa Rica for a long vacation. He sold Altinger's red Mazda 3 to a friend, concocting a story about how Altinger had given it to him. He was not just covering his tracks. He was actively writing the fiction of John Altinger's new life, a fiction designed to buy him time. But John Altinger's friends were not convinced. The emails were stilted, the language wasn't right. The sudden, unplanned trip to Costa Rica was completely out of character for their reliable, responsible friend. They knew something was terribly wrong. They organized a search party and, crucially, went to the Edmonton Police Service. The investigation began, and the digital breadcrumbs that Twitchell had so arrogantly ignored led police directly to him. The emails Altinger sent to his friends contained the address of the garage. Police quickly discovered the garage had been rented by Mark Twitchell. When they first interviewed him, Twitchell was calm, cooperative, and full of plausible explanations. He claimed he had bought the red Mazda from Altinger for $40. He presented himself as a helpful witness, a filmmaker who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigators were suspicious. They obtained a warrant to search Twitchell's car and his laptop. In the trunk of his car, they found what appeared to be blood. DNA testing later confirmed it was John Altinger's. The search of his laptop, however, provided the ultimate self-incriminating bombshell. Buried in the hard drive in a deleted folder was a 42-page document. Its file name was SK Confessions. SK stood for serial killer. The document was a diary, a script, a manifesto. Written in the first person from the perspective of a killer, it was a detailed, step-by-step account of his homicidal journey. It described his obsession with Dexter Morgan. It detailed the creation of the kill room, the luring of men via an online dating site, and the use of a hockey mask. It described, in chilling detail, the attack on the first victim, a man who fought back and escaped. And then it described the successful murder of the second victim, his dismemberment, and the attempted disposal of his body. The document was a confession disguised as fiction. To the investigators, it was a roadmap to the entire crime. It contained details only the killer and one other person could know. The mention of a victim who had escaped was the key. Police issued a public plea, asking for anyone who had a similar strange encounter to come forward. Gilles Tatro saw the news report and finally, understanding the true nature of what he had survived, he contacted the police. His testimony was the missing link. It transformed SK Confessions from a disturbing piece of writing into a factual account of a real-world crime. Armed with this evidence, police arrested Mark Twitchell. The subsequent search of the garage and the storm sewer system led to the discovery of John Altinger's remains. The story Twitchell had so carefully tried to author had completely collapsed. At his trial in 2011, Twitchell mounted a desperate defense. He claimed the entire thing was an elaborate piece of performance art, a transmedia project designed to generate buzz for his film. He argued that SK Confessions was fiction. He claimed Altinger's death was an accident, an act of self-defense that occurred when a planned fake mugging went horribly wrong. But the jury did not believe him. The meticulous planning, the evidence from the laptop, the testimony of Gilles Tatro, and the cold, hard fact of John Altinger's dismembered body told the real story. Mark Twitchell was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case of Mark Twitchell represents a terrifying evolution in copycat crime. He was not a teenager lost in fantasy. He was an adult who methodically adopted a fictional persona to justify and execute his own monstrous desires. His crime was not just about the act of killing, but about the act of creation. He was a failed artist who sought to make his mark on the world, not with a film but with a human life. He saw in Dexter Morgan not a cautionary tale about the abyss, but a blueprint for achieving a dark and lasting notoriety. He tried to write himself into a legend, but the only story he successfully authored was one of tragic, senseless loss and his own pathetic downfall. Case 4. The Friday Night Bank Robber Case. The previous accounts have explored the imitation of overt horror, the adoption of monstrous personas to commit the ultimate act of violence. They are stories of minds that latched onto the grotesque, the terrifying, and the homicidal. But the influence of fiction is not limited to the genre of fear. Sometimes the most seductive fantasies are not of death, but of rebellion. They are tales of charismatic outlaws who live by their own rules, who take what they want not with pathological malice, but with a kind of anti-establishment flair. This brings us to a crime spree that was less about a dark passenger, and more about chasing an endless summer, funded by a script written in Hollywood. In 1991, Kathryn Bigelow's film Point Break became a cultural touchstone. It starred Patrick Swayze as Bodie, the philosophical, Zen master leader of a gang of surfers who moonlighted as bank robbers. They were known as the ex-presidents, donning masks of Reagan, Carter, Nixon, and Johnson as they executed a series of swift, efficient, and audacious heists across Southern California. Their goal wasn't just money. It was a means to an end. They were, in Bodie's words, adrenaline junkies, financing their global search for the ultimate wave, the ultimate thrill. They operated with a code, a sense of detached cool. They were in and out in 90 seconds. They never fired their weapons. They were thieves, but the film portrayed them as something more. Rebels against a system that was a monument to the dead. For most, Point Break was a high-octane action movie, a piece of pure escapism. But for one man in the Pacific Northwest, it was not escapism. It was a career guide. Scott Scurlock was not an obvious candidate for a life of crime. Born in 1955, he was intelligent, handsome, and charismatic. He grew up in Olympia, Washington, the son of a Baptist minister. But from an early age, He possessed a deep-seated distrust of authority and a powerful desire to live life on his own terms. He was a thrill-seeker, drawn to rock climbing, bungee jumping, and anything that pushed the limits. After a brief and unfulfilling stint in college, he drifted, eventually finding a lucrative but dangerous niche: cooking crystal methamphetamine. His small-scale drug lab gave him his first taste of a life outside the law, a life funded by illicit enterprise. But it was also a life of paranoia and risk. He wanted something bigger, something with more style, more control. Then he saw Point Break. The film resonated with Skurlock on a profound level. He saw himself in Bodhi. He was captivated not just by the action, but by the philosophy. The idea of rejecting the mundane 9-to-5 world, of using crime not merely for greed but to finance a life of true freedom, was intoxicating. He began to obsess over the film, watching it repeatedly, studying the methods of the ex-presidents. He saw their 90-second robberies not as a cinematic flourish, but as a practical, executable plan. Skurlock decided to become a real-life Bodhi, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He recruited 2 accomplices, Mark Biggins and Steve Myers, young men from his orbit who were mesmerized by his confidence and his vision. Skurlock was the undisputed leader, the mastermind. He was charismatic, persuasive, and utterly convinced of his plan's brilliance. His preparation was not that of a common thug. It was that of a director staging a complex production. He was meticulous, patient, and detail-oriented. He would spend weeks casing a potential target bank. He would sit in his car with a stopwatch, timing the flow of customers, the routines of the guards, the changing of the shifts. He mapped out escape routes, noting traffic patterns at different times of the day. He was a student of the craft. His most distinctive touch, however, was the one that would earn him his nickname. Skurlock, inspired by the masks of the ex-presidents but seeking a more realistic edge, became a master of theatrical disguise. He would spend hours applying complex Hollywood-grade makeup and prosthetics. He'd craft a new identity for each robbery: a fake nose, a different hair color, a change in skin tone, a subtle beard. He transformed himself so completely that witnesses would give wildly different descriptions of the same man. The press, marveling at his chameleonic abilities, dubbed him Hollywood. The spree began in 1992. The crew, led by Skurlock, operated with the cool efficiency of their cinematic heroes. They almost always struck on Fridays, just before closing time, when cash reserves were at their peak for the weekend. This methodical timing led to another moniker: the Friday Night Bank Robber. Their method was a carbon copy of the Point Break template. They would burst in, screaming and brandishing weapons to command absolute control. Skurlock would often vault over the counter, a move of athletic intimidation. They were loud, they were aggressive, but they tried to avoid gratuitous violence. Their goal was speed. They would terrorize the employees into submission, empty the cash drawers and the vault, and be gone in under 2 minutes. It was a well-oiled machine, and it was stunningly successful. Over 4 years, from 1992 to 1996, Skurlock and his crew robbed nearly 20 banks in the Seattle area, stealing over $2.3 million. It was one of the most successful and prolific bank robbery sprees in American history. And what did Skurlock do with his fortune? He lived his fantasy. He purchased a large, secluded plot of land deep in the Washington woods. And there, he built his masterpiece, a physical manifestation of his anti-system philosophy, a multi-level, state-of-the-art treehouse. It was not a child's plaything. It was a luxurious, complex structure built high in the canopy, complete with multiple rooms, electricity, and even a hot tub. It had rope bridges and secret escape routes. It was his fortress of solitude, his personal Shangri-La, a place where he believed the rules of the world below did not apply. He was Bodhi, living off the grid, financing his freedom one heist at a time. But reality, unlike a movie, does not have a tidy 90-minute runtime, and the FBI does not give up. As the Hollywood heists continued, a dedicated task force was assigned to the case. They painstakingly collected evidence, analyzed witness statements, and began to piece together a profile of their elusive target. The pressure mounted. Skurlock grew more paranoid, more reclusive in his treehouse fortress. The thrill was beginning to curdle into fear. The carefree fantasy was being eroded by the constant threat of capture. The final act came on Thanksgiving Eve, November 27, 1996. Skurlock, perhaps needing one last big score, decided to break his Friday rule. He and his two accomplices, Mark Biggins and Steve Myers, targeted a Seafirst bank in the Lake City neighborhood of Seattle. They donned their disguises this time, simple fake beards and glasses, and burst in. But the script had changed. The police, acting on a tip, were already in the area. They had been watching. As the robbers fled the bank with bags of cash, they were met with the immediate reality of armed law enforcement. The cinematic fantasy of a clean getaway evaporated in a hail of gunfire. A brutal shootout erupted on the quiet residential street. Steve Myers and Mark Biggins were hit. They fell to the pavement, their roles in the movie abruptly and violently concluded. Skurlock, however, managed to escape the initial fusillade. Wounded, he fired back at police, creating enough chaos to flee the scene on foot. He had escaped, but he was trapped. The police response was massive. A 40-block perimeter was established. Helicopters swarmed overhead, their searchlights cutting through the rainy November night. Hundreds of officers, many leaving their Thanksgiving dinners, descended on the neighborhood, searching every house, every yard, every car. Skurlock, bleeding and desperate, found temporary refuge. He broke into a nearby home and hid inside a camper van parked in the backyard. For hours, he waited in the cold darkness as the dragnet tightened around him. He could hear the dogs, the helicopters, the shouts of the police. He knew there was no escape. The movie was over. The credits were about to roll. As police officers finally surrounded the camper, calling for him to surrender, Scott Skurlock made his final choice. He had lived his life trying to emulate a fictional character, a man who sought the ultimate ride and was willing to die for it. But faced with the real-world consequence of a long prison sentence, he opted for a different kind of exit. He placed the muzzle of his gun to his head and pulled the trigger. The aftermath was a grim inventory of a shattered fantasy. His accomplices, Biggins and Myers, survived the shootout but were captured and sentenced to long prison terms. The police, searching Skurlock's property, found the elaborate treehouse. It stood as a silent, hollow monument to a dream built on stolen money and terror. Inside, they found cash, weapons, and a copy of the novel Point Break. The story of Scott Skurlock, the Hollywood robber, is a stark illustration of how a fantasy of rebellion can be just as deadly as a fantasy of horror. He didn't want to be a monster, he wanted to be a folk hero. He saw in Point Break a vision of a life lived with intensity and freedom, a life that spat in the eye of the establishment. But he failed to understand the film's most critical lesson. The fantasy is unsustainable. Bodhi himself is last seen paddling out to face a monstrous, unsurvivable wave, choosing a beautiful death over the indignity of capture. Skurlock's end was not beautiful. It was desperate, lonely, and violent, played out not on a sun-drenched Australian beach, but in a stranger's cold, dark camper van on a rainy night in Seattle. He successfully imitated the crime, but he could not escape the reality of its consequences. From the nihilistic road trip of Mickey and Mallory to the self-aware slasher of Scream. From the meticulous ritual of a killer who hunts killers to the adrenaline-fueled heists of a cinematic antihero. The stories we have explored tonight are more than just tales of crime. They are unsettling case studies in the power of narrative. They reveal the fragile boundary that separates admiration from obsession, fantasy from a plan. For the victims, the distinction is meaningless. Their loss is real, their trauma is permanent. These cases serve as a somber reminder that while fiction can illuminate the darkest corners of the human condition, for some, it serves only as a map to lead them there. For now, from all of us at the Crime Folio, we wish you a safe and peaceful night. Sleep well.